Welcome to Epg Pathshala. In this module, we look at the relationship between economics and ecology. Concerns for sustainable development are getting more and more evident over the last 4 decades, since the Stockholm Conference in 1972, followed by a host of others. Rio Plus 20 in 2012 came out with a document titled The Future We Want and called for ensuring the promotion of an economically, socially and environmentally sustainable future for our planet and for present and future generations. Such an effort also set the stage to plan for a detailed agenda for future course of action that took the form of preparing another important document, Transforming Our World, that is going to guide our quest for sustainable development during the coming 15 years. It develops a list of 17 sustainable development goals and 169 targets to achieve them. 5 areas of critical importance for humanity and the planet are identified in that draft 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that was released on 3rd of August 2015. These are the 5 P's. First, people, elimination of poverty and hunger in all their forms and dimensions, and to ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. Second P stands for planet, protecting the planet from degradation, including through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing its natural resources and taking urgent action on climate change so that it can support the needs of the present and future generations. The third P stands for prosperity, ensuring that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives and that economic, social and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. Fourth P stands for peace, fostering peaceful, just and inclusive societies which are free from fear and violence, as those who framed the document firmly believed that there can be no sustainable development without peace and no peace without sustainable development. And the fifth P stands for partnership, mobilizing the means required to implement this agenda through a revitalized global partnership for sustainable development based on a spirit of strengthened global solidarity, focused in particular on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable, and with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders and all people. In a nutshell, the document calls for a strategy that ensures inclusive growth for humanity in the coming days and simultaneously protects the planet from rapid degradation that, unless tackled sensibly from now onwards, can threaten the very existence of human life in particular and the ecosystem in general in the foreseeable future. While the first concern falls traditionally in the domain of economics, the second concern is within the realm of ecology. The present section looks into the apparent contradictions between the two branches of knowledge in terms of their conceptual framework and also tracks the recent efforts at an interdisciplinary approach to reduce the evident conflicts between the two, namely economics and ecology. A Facebook meme which went viral recently reads, "The earth is 4.6 billion years old. Let us scale that to 46 years. We have been here for 4 hours. Our industrial revolution began 1 minute ago. In that time, we have destroyed more than 50% of the world's forests." Unquote. A few stylized facts from Barbier, whose book appeared in 2014, will also be in order in this context. And I quote, "Since 1970, the World Bank's World Development Indicators have provided estimates for most countries of the adjustments to national income, income growth and savings that arise from net depletion of forests, energy resources and minerals. This rate of natural capital depreciation as a percentage of adjusted net national income over the past 4 decades is alarming. The decline in natural capital has been 5 times greater on average in developing economies than in the 8 richest countries. Natural capital depreciation in all countries has risen significantly since the 1990s. There was a dip during the global recession of 2008-2009, but as the world economy has recovered, so has the rate of resource use. According to the worldwide Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, approximately 60% of major global ecosystem services have been degraded or used unsustainably, including fresh water, wild fisheries, air and water purification, and the regulation of regional and local climate, natural hazards and pests." Unquote. These facts underscore the conflict between the quest for economic growth and maintaining the ecosystem in its desired state that ensures sustainable livelihoods for human beings for many years to come. Thomas Malthus was perhaps the first to raise a concern about the possibility of such a conflict that coincided with the height of industrial revolution in Europe. He argued that while the capacity of Earth to produce food had been growing in arithmetic progression, human population, aided by the continuous growth in economic activities, had been growing at geometric progression, striking a cautionary note about the possibility of limits to growth, an issue taken up right in earnest by the Club of Rome during the early 1970s. It showed the possibility of exhaustion of finite resources, namely mineral reserves, at its existing rate of use juxtaposed with the prevailing rate of growth of economy and population, unless new reserves and sources were identified to enhance the supply of those resources. In spite of severe criticism hurled at the data and methods used and conclusions arrived at, the believers in limits to growth soldiered on and produced its last sequel in 2011 when Ugo Bardi asserted that, quote, "The warnings that we received in 1972 are becoming increasingly more worrisome as reality seems to be following closely the curves that the scenario had generated." Unquote. Economics and ecology. What are the fundamental differences between these two disciplines? While an ecologist considers human beings to be part of the ecosystem and linked to the overall natural resources, both living and non-living, in an integrated chain of relationships, an economist considers the human beings as located away from the ecosystem with the capability to use its components in ways that optimizes human welfare in a material sense. Economists believe in optimizing human welfare by increasing its capacity to produce and consequently consume goods and services that gets captured in steadily increased GDP and of late Human Development Index. The different components of nature are to be utilized to facilitate movement of the economy along such a desired pathway, with earth being used both as a source of resource and sink of beds produced in the process but not feed for consumption by human beings. In so doing, economists do not distinguish between the resources that are man-made and those produced by nature. There had also been a strong belief among economists for years that technological developments will facilitate man-made production of most of the natural resources as and when such necessity occurs. Ecologists, on the other hand, do believe that most of the natural resources, if not all, can only be consumed by human beings but may never be produced by them and hence should be used with restraint. Further, use of nature as a sink for beds can jeopardize the functioning of the ecosystem in a manner that can lead to ultimate collapse of the ecosystem, threatening the survival of mankind as one species of the thousands found on this Noah's Ark. The concern for sustainable development and the realization that neither economics nor ecology can pursue their disciplinary pursuits oblivious of the contrasting leads emanating from each other has led to attempts at reconciling these conceptual conflicts. A recent article by Herman Daly captures the diverging worldview of economists and ecologists and a possible way of reconciliation in a very succinct manner. According to him, such an integration is attempted through three distinct strategies. The first is what he calls economic imperialism, the second is what Daly calls ecological reductionism, and the third he offers as steady state subsystem. Economy is considered as a subsystem of the finite ecosystem in each of these three strategies. However, the strategies differ in terms of their pathways. The strategy of economic imperialism seeks to expand the boundary of the economic subsystem until it encompasses the entire ecosphere. The goal is one system, the macroeconomy as a whole. In a typical neoclassical worldview, subjective individual preference in the aggregate are taken as the ultimate source of value, and the expansion is considered legitimate as long as costs of such expansion, that is costs of degradation of ecosystem, are internalized. Which is to say, all costs resulting out of degradation of ecosystem will be identified and added to the value of the products or services. Only those who are willing to and have a capability of paying such enhanced price will get to consume them, with the rest kept out of bounds. With increased extent of ecosystem degradation and the consequent hike in the prices of goods and services so produced, there will be an inbuilt control mechanism that will limit the extent of degradation before it reaches a sustainable level. Following diagram explains the perspective in detail. Consumption of goods and services produced out of an economic system provides utility. Following the law of diminishing marginal utility, the utility derived from an incremental unit of a good or services will decline as consumption increases. Internalization of costs of ecosystem degradation, both in terms of use of natural resources beyond the limit of its natural growth and use of nature as a sink of production wastes, will also add to disutility of consuming a product, and the incremental disutility will increase with increased consumption of the goods or services in question. So the marginal utility curve slopes downward to the right, while the marginal disutility curve moves in the opposite direction. In a typical neoclassical framework, the point of intersection between these two lines gives the economic limit to growth. If resources are still consumed to ensure increased level of production and consumption, the nature may reach a tipping point of environmental catastrophe, akin to a collapse of the ecosystem. Ideally, the point of economic limit to growth is expected to lie to the left of the point of environmental catastrophe and hence provide some precious time to mankind to wake up to the desired course of action. The futility limit marked at the far right corner of the diagram refers to the point of complete satiation on the part of the consumer. One derives no increment in total utility beyond this point. It is felt that in case the costs of degradation of ecosystems are internalized in the process of production and consumption, environmental catastrophe will strike well before the point of complete satiation is reached. This strategy gives rise to the specialized discipline in economics referred to as environmental economics. The approach nevertheless is unconvincing. Many of these costs are not foreseen, let alone imagined, following the argument of bounded rationality put forward by Herbert Simon. Simon argued that human beings are not capable of perfect prediction about all future events as is assumed under the condition of rationality. Complete internalization of the costs of ecosystem degradation is thus difficult to achieve in reality. Further, even if some such external costs are visible, proper enforcement mechanisms often take a long time and may be partial in effecting the desired level of internalization. The still inconclusive debate on climate change is a case in point. Thus, the effective internalization process may not be perfect, either leading us to a similar situation that characterizes the deviation from an ideal market system posited by the neoclassical school of economic thought in the form of lack of complete set of perfect market. Here we end up with the lack of a mechanism to ensure complete and perfect internalization of ecosystem degradation. It will be pertinent at this juncture to refer to a question raised by Herman Daly. Quote, are we better off at the new larger scale with formerly free goods correctly priced, or at the old smaller scale with free goods also correctly priced? In both cases, the prices are right. This is the surpassed question of optimal scale, not answered, indeed not even asked by neoclassical economics. Unquote. Ecological reductionism. Ecological reductionism, the second strategy as argued by Herman Daly, believes that human behavior can also be explained by the same set of natural laws that explain the behavior of other components of natural, and thus proposes to erase the boundary of economic subsystems and subsumes it within the natural system. Daly argues that it begins with the true insight that humans and markets are not exempt from the laws of nature. It then proceeds to the false inference that human action is totally explainable by reducible to the laws of nature. Taken to the extreme in this view, all is explained by a materialistic deterministic system of nature that has no room for the purpose or will that distinguish man from the other components of nature. The argument of ecological reductionism derives its strength from the second law of thermodynamics. It was N. Georgescu Roegen in his book The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, published in 1971, who argued that it was the phenomenon of free energy tending to disperse and getting lost in the form of bound energy that drives an economic process. He is thus considered one of the founding fathers of ecological economics. Even though he termed his new approach as bioeconomics, his arguments centered around the fact that human beings, like all other living beings, depend on energy available in usable form in the natural resources, referred to in the literature as free energy. However, once the resources are used and the fact they are not fully recyclable, with some portion being thrown back to the nature as wastage, we tend to generate energy that is no longer available for consumption. They are called bound energy. Entropy, as per Georgescu Roegen, is the measure of the unavailable or bound energy that is created within the natural system we live in. It is posited that humankind has the distinction of currently being the most significant contributor to entropic degradation by the increasing rates of extraction of natural resources and elimination of wastes into the environment. Other living beings also feed on how entropy sources of energy to build and preserve their complex structure and dissipate the energy in a higher entropic state. However, their contribution to the rise in the entropy level is insignificant compared to that by the human beings. The proof of human beings contributing to the alarmingly rising entropy in the ecosystem can be located in plenty in the existing literature. Increased entropy manifests in several ways in influencing the human life and welfare. Some of them are direct and some others are indirect. For the direct impacts, we have already mentioned above the observation by Berbier, who found that the share of natural resources depletion in the adjusted GNI of most of the countries was quite significant. As per a document available on the website of National Geographic, some impacts from increasing temperatures are already happening, and we list them below. Ice is melting worldwide, especially at the Earth's poles. This includes mountain glaciers, ice sheets covering West Antarctica and Greenland, and Arctic sea ice. Researcher Bill Fraser has tracked the decline of the Adelie penguins on Antarctica, where the numbers have fallen from 32,000 breeding pairs to 11,000 in last 30 years. Sea level rise became faster over the last century. Some butterflies, foxes and alpine plants have moved further north or to a higher cooler areas. Precipitation, that is rain or snowfall, has increased across the globe on average. Spruce bark beetles have boomed in Alaska thanks to 20 years of warm summers. The insects have chewed up 4 million acres of spruce trees. It also notes that if warming continues, if the global warming continues, then what would happen? and we list below the projections. Sea levels are expected to rise between 7 to 23 inches, that is 18 to 59 centimeters by the end of the century, and continued melting at the poles could add between 4 to 8 inches, that is 10 to 20 centimeters. Hurricanes and other storms are likely to become stronger. Species that depend on one another may become out of sync. For example, plants could bloom earlier than their pollinating insects become active. Floods and droughts will become more common. Rainfall in Ethiopia, where droughts are already common, could decline by 10% over the next 50 years. Less fresh water will be available. If the Quelchia ice cap in Peru continues to melt at its current rate, it will be gone by 2100, leaving thousands of people who rely on it for drinking water and electricity without a source of either. Some diseases will spread, such as malaria carried by mosquitoes. Ecosystems will change. Some species will move further north or become more successful. Others won't be able to move and could become extinct. Wildlife research scientist Martin Obard has found that since the mid-1980s, with less ice on which to live and fish for food, polar bears have gotten considerably skinnier. Polar bear biologist Ian Sterling has found a similar pattern in Hudson Bay. He fears that if sea ice disappears, the polar bears will disappear as well. Now for the indirect effects. Bartoloni, in his publication that appeared in 2003, argues that negative externalities generated in two forms contribute to the economic growth process of human societies. They are positional externalities, desire of human beings to acquire a higher relative position in the social ladder, and the environmental externalities that reduce the extent of availability of free goods to human beings. For example, economic growth ensures that pure drinking water is also getting priced today, which was freely available all around the world even a few decades back. Thomas F. Homer Dixon, in his work that got published in 1994, identified 6 types of environmental change as plausible cause of violent intergroup conflict, and these 6 are: first, greenhouse-induced climate change; second, stratospheric ozone depletion; third, degradation and loss of good agricultural land; fourth, degradation and removal of forest; fifth, degradation and pollution of freshwater supplies; and sixth, depletion of fisheries. He tested 3 hypotheses to link these changes with violent conflicts and found them to be positive. I quote, first, decreasing supply of physically controllable environmental resources such as clean water and good agricultural land would provoke interstate simple scarcity conflicts or resource wars. Secondly, large population movements caused by environmental stress would induce group identity conflicts, especially ethnic clashes. And third, severe environmental scarcity would simultaneously increase economic deprivation and disrupt key social institutions, which in turn would cause deprivation conflicts such as civil strife and insurgency. Unquote. The followers in ecological reductionism firmly believes that, like the tragedy of commons elaborated by Garrett Hardin in his work in 1968, we are also in for tragedy of entropy. The process of increasing entropy cannot be reversed. Herman Daly disagrees and suggests that collective actions like those successfully avoided the tragedy of commons. Look up Elinor Ostrom's work published in 1992 for details. And these are necessary to overcome the tragedy of entropy. One should not give up and profess a process that suggests erasing the boundaries between ecosystems and human economic system. The literature on linking social and ecological systems and the issue of their resilience also highlights the role of collective action and social mechanisms for building resilience in managing the rising entropy. We may refer to some of the pertinent debates in India vis-a-vis conservation versus development. A recent article in Economic and Political Weekly entitled "The Debate on Biodiversity Conservation in the Western Ghats" by Nagarajan and others can provide us with the point of departure in extending our argument. The study contrasts between the finding by the Western Ghats Ecology Experts Panel headed by Madhav Gadgil, and high-level working group headed by K. Kasturirangan. In response to the same set of terms of reference, the former proposed the whole of the Western Ghats as ecologically sensitive, close to the philosophy of ecological reductionism, while the latter declared only 37% of the area as sensitive from an ecological perspective, akin to the ideas of economic imperialism. The two studies used methodologies and data that were altogether different from one another, reflecting their respective worldviews. And interestingly, none of them considered the ground level political situation that would set the contours of possible collective action in an effort to reach a mutually acceptable point of agreement. The debate on the issue of conservation around the Western Ghats also raises a fundamental issue vis-a-vis the entropy literature. Even though human activities on a macro level contribute to the rising entropy in the ecosystem, there are communities who live in close harmony with nature and hardly add any irritant to the process of upsetting the ecosystem balance. Neither do they use natural resources at a rate that goes beyond their natural growth rate, nor do they generate wastes that are highly non-degradable and hence beyond the capacity of nature to absorb on its own. However, these micro entities are not powerful enough to influence the discourse on what measures are to be taken to bring about a balance between economics and ecology to maintain Mother Earth as a livable planet on sustainable basis. Consequently, they are held hostages by both the groups professing economic imperialism and ecological reductionism, and often are severed from the intimate relationship they have been maintaining with nature for time immemorial. Argument in terms of collective action calls for their effective inclusion in the process of dialogue. The third strategy that Herman Daly suggested was that of the steady state subsystem. The idea of steady state subsystem owes its origin to John Stuart Mill's work in 1857, wherein he coined the concept of a stationary state, when the population growth and the growth rate of capital accumulation would both be zero. A zero growth rate of population would mean equality between birth and death rates, whereas a zero rate of growth in capital stock would imply production equals to depreciation. Such a state would, however, require the rates to be equal at a lower level, indicating high human longevity and durability of goods and services produced, subject to maintenance of sufficient stocks for a high quality of life. Under such a steady state, the boundary of the economic subsystem is no longer required to be eliminated through either expansion or contraction. Herman Daly argues that such a boundary must be recognized and drawn at the right place. Such an exercise would also underscore the acceptance of the qualitative difference between human economy and natural ecosystem. Daly maintains, and I quote, "The scale of the human subsystem defined by the boundary has an optimum, and the throughput by which the ecosphere physically maintains and replenishes the economic subsystem must be ecologically sustainable." That throughput is indeed entropic, but rather than maximizing entropy, the goal of the economy is to minimize low entropy use needed for a sufficient standard of living by shifting low entropy slowly and carefully through efficient technologies aimed at important purposes. The economy should not be viewed as an idiot machine dedicated to maximizing wastes. Its final cause is not the maximization of wastes, but the maintenance and enjoyment of life, unquote. By the way of conclusion, we can say that in an earlier section, we identified the difference in the worldview between mainstream economics and ecologists. The discussion so far has clarified the need to build a working bridge to take care of such fundamental differences. The difference in approach also feeds into the divergence in the methodological toolkits available to the economists and ecologists to settle the issue of sustainable development. Recent efforts at developing green national accounts are a move in the right direction. Inclusive Wealth Report 2014, prepared by a group of experts under the leadership of Partha Dasgupta, also sought to fill some of the data gaps with a well-comprehended framework to conceptualize inclusive wealth that would help us get into a path of sustainable development and simultaneously thrive to ensure intragenerational equity coupled with an intergenerational one. However, there are some methodological challenges to be overcome to identify the desired pathways in settling reconciliation between economics and ecology. A conceptual framework that facilitates to understand the linkages between humanity and nature at the micro level and is capable of being blown up at the macro level is urgently required today. Otherwise, we shall get trapped into arguments calling for solutions that offer highest social and environmental returns in our quest for sustainable development. Needless to add, such an approach will fail to distinguish the implications of the macro policies on multitude of species and human communities at the micro level. Further, a welfare economics framework is needed that incorporates nature as a prominent stakeholder. Given the several non-convexities and non-linearities in the production and consumption behavior of nature and the rest of non-human species, the conceptual challenge will be pretty